To the Great Basin seasonal outlook for January through April. Over the last 7 to 14 days, we've seen pretty dry conditions across most areas of the Great Basin. The only exceptions have been into parts of the Sierra and also into parts of Idaho, where they have had some light precipitation this last week, and then over a week ago, some light precipitation in southeast Utah. But as you can see from the image on the right, all areas really are seeing well below normal precipitation for the last 2 weeks. Over the last 30 days, still very similar conditions with a really dry and warm December. This was a fairly warm December, even on record across much of the Great Basin. You can see the temperatures here showing that above normal temperature trend over much of the west. And then precipitation over the last month, very dry conditions, especially across Nevada and Utah, into northern Arizona, and even into parts of Idaho. Again, very few areas of the Great Basin have even seen close to normal precipitation for the last 30 days. Since the beginning of the water year, October 1st of 2023, still, again, very dry conditions. I really haven't seen very wet conditions at all since the beginning of the fall into the winter. Snowpack, as you would imagine, is also well below normal in all areas. The only areas doing slightly better would be the northern Utah mountains, which are above 70% or so of normal, or right around there. Everywhere else is really below about 50 to 70%. We will see some changes, luckily, going into January, but again, December has really been a dry month. So looking at some of our fuel moisture, all fuels are really in dormancy this time of year, but looking at some of our soil moisture, still do have good soil moistures up north, but as you can see with the drier conditions we've seen recently, fairly low soil moistures for much of Nevada, Utah, and down into northern Arizona. Looking at our drought monitor and outlook, we haven't really seen much drought across the Great Basin recently with our wet conditions in 2022 going through the winter and spring of 2023. But we are seeing some drying happening in central Idaho, which is new just with the recent below normal precipitation we've seen. Still no technical drought up there, but just showing abnormally dry conditions. Again, we will start to see some precipitation moving through this month, so hopefully that eventually disappears up there. Further south, we've continued with these abnormally dry or even moderate drought conditions lingering along the Utah-Colorado border, also into northern Arizona and far southern Nevada. But as you can see, the rest of the Great Basin are really drought-free at this time. And looking at the drought outlook on the right, really showing no drought developing over much of the Great Basin and even showing some improving conditions expected over eastern Utah down into southern areas of the Great Basin. However, up north, especially if we see drier conditions going through the winter with El Nino settling in, we could see some additional drought development up into central Idaho later in the winter. Looking at our drought time series, again, this is taking us through, this is just showing Nevada, but it's really representative of many areas of the Great Basin, showing the drought conditions that start on the left here in the year 2000 and go all the way through the 23 years, taking us into the early part of 2024. The black boxes are when we have seen above normal fire seasons in Nevada, or really in any area of the Great Basin that's more low elevation fires that really are dependent on fine fuels. So you can see much of that occurs in years we do not have drought, and you can see where we are in the drought process here. Obviously, a very little, if any, drought in the Great Basin, so we're really entering into these years of potential increased fire seasons going into 2024. This will obviously largely depend on what occurs over the next 6 months and the weather we see during the fire season, but again, the potential is there with carryover fine fuel growth and the fine fuel growth we have seen, and then the potential for new fine fuel growth depending on the winter. So kind of putting everything in the past, we've looked at what has been happening recently, so what happens here in the future. We have been talking a lot about La Nina and El Nino. We are currently in a state of El Nino. This is where the chart here at the very top, you can see in the red showing a moderate to strong El Nino occurring at the current time. All the lines are different model projections of the expectations for the sea surface temperatures going through the next several months into the rest of the year. And you can see we are looking at somewhat of a decline of these sea surface temperatures, so we'll likely stay in this red area, this state of El Nino going through the spring. And then once we enter the fire season, and especially into the fall, we could be heading out of that El Nino and seeing more neutral conditions. So again, we'll talk about how this will affect us in the fire season and the winter as we go forward. So here's our typical winter impacts when we have El Nino. Typically, we see wetter and cooler conditions over the southern areas of the West, including southern areas of the Great Basin. and warmer and potentially drier weather, or warmer and kind of a mix of either drier or near normal precipitation in the north. We haven't quite seen that shift to this weather pattern yet, but typically it does happen throughout the month of January, so we will likely see this emerge later this month and potentially continuing through February and March. So here's our upcoming precipitation. Like I mentioned, things will definitely be changing with the weather patterns. We are seeing more systems dropping into the Great Basin off the Pacific and out of the Pacific Northwest here in the coming weeks, and even out of Canada heading into the middle of the month. So we will see opportunities for colder temperatures, certainly some wind, but also precipitation. And this is the precipitation forecast from January 3rd through the 10th. So again, most areas seeing at least the potential for some light precipitation with potentially more of that heavier precipitation in the higher terrain, obviously in the form of snowfall. So again, this is good news for the Great Basin. We definitely need precipitation as we have been very dry. So we'll see how this unfolds the next couple of weeks and what continues over the next couple of months. So this is the 8 to 14 day outlook, which again mirrors that precipitation forecast, showing cooler and wetter conditions for the Great Basin heading through mid-January. And it looks like about every few days, maybe every 3 or 4 days, we'll have another cold front and system moving through the Great Basin, giving us that possibility of rain and snowfall, colder temperatures, and wind. Looking at the 4-month outlook from Predictive Services, the top row is the temperature forecast, and you can see generally those warmer conditions remaining in the northern half of the Great Basin through February, and cooler conditions down south. And we could see those cooler conditions maybe shift a little bit further north in March, but then push further south in April. Looking at the precipitation forecast on the bottom row, you can see still the wetter conditions mainly more in the desert southwest, Southern California going into January and February, but clipping the Great Basin on the southern edge, and then maybe more potential towards March, maybe even April for those wetter conditions in the south, but still showing more of a drier signature up north, which again would be more typical for the El Nino weather pattern. So putting everything together for our outlook, that would generally mean just normal conditions going through April at this point. Again, we'll continue to see winter cold fronts move through, bringing us precipitation and colder temperatures, keeping fire potential relatively quiet, which would be normal for the time of year. Could see a few upticks in fire potential if we see a prolonged dry period, which is also followed by windy conditions. But right now, it's not looking like we're going to see that prolonged dry period once the precipitation starts this week and this weekend anytime soon. So that does minimize that threat. And again, just generally keeping things on the quiet side. Now, once we approach April or even May and June, we may start to see conditions change depending on the winter precipitation and the fine fuel growth. That's what we'll be watching closely as we start monitoring the expectations for the fire season. So that concludes our webcast for this month. Check back on February 1st for the latest updates.